video, we'll cover the new feature to automatically create break line items in the check entry window of Datatech's payroll software. Previously, users had to enter in their breaks manually through the daily payroll entry and then use the rest and recovery pay rate report to calculate the pay rates for the break line items. Customers that had previously used the check entry window requested that a similar option be added to the check entry window so they didn't have to change methods of payroll entry. In addition to adding the rate calculation, we have actually added a feature that will automatically create the break line items as well. For written instructions on how to use this new feature, please go to our blog, blog.datatechag.com, and look for the article Rest and Recovery Features Added to Batch Check Entry. For more information on how the rates are calculated, please refer to the California website, the Department of Industrial Relations, from dir.ca.gov, and look for piece rate compensation FAQs. Here you'll find more information on how the rates are calculated and examples of compensation methods. Before we use the feature, there's two pieces of information that needs to be set up. To begin, we'll go on the payroll menu to set up and then the rest and recovery time table. Previously, this table was used for two things. One, in the daily payroll, the rest and recovery pay rate report used the information here to determine which line items were rest and recovery entries, so it knew which items to update the rates. The second thing that this was used for was for our Safe Harbor Reports module that went back and analyzed past payroll to determine what break pay should have been paid to the employees. So some customers have multiple lines set up in here with rest and recovery and non-productive coding. For this new feature, what we need to do is tell the program when the break lines are created, what job, cost ID, or GL number you want the program to use. So you can come to your rest and recovery entry that's set up for your daily payroll rest and recovery pay rate report and add on a few pieces of information. Your wage type may differ, but here my wage code is RR for rest and recovery. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my jobs and add on the job that I use to identify break time. If you also use a different cost center or GL number for your break entries, you can enter those as well. I'm going to leave them blank so that the program will just use the cost ID and GL number from the piecework line items. We have our rest and recovery type here. For our labor contractors, they may have the combined billing check marked. The max hours was used for the Safe Harbor report, so we don't need to worry about that here on this entry. And then for this entry that we want to be our main default settings, when the lines are created, we mark that default button. Now, if you get into breaks and overtime, you'll want to add on one more code here with the wage type for your rest and recovery overtime. And again, identifying what job you want used when those line items are created. So if you have an alternate job for overtime breaks, you can select that as well. And again, since this is going to be used when the program creates the breaks for you, we want to mark the default on this line item as well. So both of these will have a default button in this case. Now the second item we need to set up is on the check entry window itself. So we'll come into our checks menu and our check entry, and then we'll come down to our breaks button. If you don't have a breaks button on your window, then go to your tools menu and select the check for updates option to download the latest version of the program. That will add this new feature for doing breaks. The setup break time entry is used to tell the program, based on the hours worked, how much break needs to be paid. So depending on your procedures, you may have here over 3 hours or maybe 3.5 hours, they get allocated one break. Then we may have over 6, or let's say if you do 6 and they get one break, we may need to do 605 here, and then reflect that they're getting 2 breaks. Now I am just basing this off the minimum of 10-minute breaks. So we have 20 minutes out of an hour is a third of an hour, 0.34. If you do 2 15-minute breaks, then that would be half an hour or 0.5. So based on, again, your procedures, you can enter in the allocation of time there. Now, if you get into overtime, then you may have the 2 regular breaks and then our overtime break. And again, we set that up on our table, so the program will use a different wage code there for the overtime break. Now that our break setup is complete, I'm going to go ahead and pull up a check that I've already entered. So you can see we have some piecework lines. We have a couple different cost centers, and again, our labor contractors, this heading would say be crop ID. It's the same field. And so now we have our piecework hours. Now in this entry, we would now put in the total hours worked for that entry, including the break times. This is a little bit different than the daily payroll where you had to split it out, because now the whole idea, the feature of the program is that it's going to subtract that for you. So based on our table here, our days where they worked under 6 hours, we're only going to see 1 break created, and then the other entries will have 2. So now to create our break entries, we just come back to our breaks button and click add break line items. So now we see our half an hour break on the 6th and 7th, and then our 8th and our 10th, we only get 1 break. And then those times, those entries are now reducing our piecework hours entries. And then you can see, we mentioned earlier, if you don't put in a unique crop or cost ID for the break entries, then the program will retain the cost ID from what was entered in on the piecework line. Now, if you have multiple piecework entries on the same day, the program will use the cost ID that has the highest amount of hours. It really gets into too much detail to prorate it or split it among all cost centers. So it will use the cost center that has the highest amount of hours. Now, if you need to make a correction, just as you're used to doing, you are able to come in and edit any of your entries up until the checks have been printed. So now if we've changed our pieces, that's of course going to change our hourly rate. So we can go ahead and go back down to the breaks button. This is really important that you do this if you've made changes, and select calculate R&R pay rate. That will go back through your piecework wages, and actually your wages exclusive of the rest and recovery compensation, and recalculate the average hourly rate, and then update those line items accordingly. Now, if you need to make any corrections to the hours after the rest and recovery has been calculated, you would need to factor in the changes that have already been made. So let's say with this entry here, we had originally input 5 hours, and maybe they really only worked 4. So on this entry, I'm just going to reduce an hour. I'm not going to change the whole entry to 4 because we've already pulled out the allocation for the break time. And again, if you change those hours, that is going to need to be reflected in their rate. We want to recalculate their rest and recovery pay rate. Now, another example that you may have is where an employee does not make minimum wage. So I'm going to go back and reset my hours. And maybe on this entry, they didn't make minimum wage. In the check entry, normally when you saved the check, the program would prompt you to make that minimum wage adjustment. Now, when you say create or add the break line items, it will make the adjustment at that point, because that adjustment needs to be factored into that average hourly rate. The next example is when you do have overtime. So I'm going to change my entry here to overtime. They worked 10.5 hours that day. Now, when you do the break line items, it is going to create 2 entries if the setup is done properly with a different wage code for the overtime breaks. It'll make 1 entry with the regular rest and recovery code, and then it will take the other code set up for rest and recovery overtime, and it will pay that out at time and a half. So you see their base rate here on their check, but they'll receive time and a half that rate on their actual physical check. Now, the last example is when you have a combination of piecework and hourly. When you have hourly days combined into a week with piecework, you are supposed to also pay the breaks on the hourly days at that rate as well. A lot of people miss that little nuance in the regulations, but that's in that DIR website address I mentioned on the outset. So after all your entries are in, it will factor in the regular hours into the average pay rate. And then when we break the line items, it will do the same allocation, taking the break out of the regular hours line and then creating a new line with the breaks at the break rate. So that is a review of the new features to automatically create break entries in the check entry window. If you have any questions, feel free to email support, SUPPORT, at datatechag.com. And once we have this similar option available in the daily payroll entry, we will post a notice on our blog and then shortly thereafter record another video like this one. Thank you very much for your time.